The incredible spires of the remarkable city of Prague in the Czech Republic, in Central Europe. A city that's seen, no doubt, many different days. And what exactly has this city seen? What's the history of these incredible structures with their fine geometric precision, their artistry and craftsmanship displayed on every single structure? What has this city seen, and what does it really tell us about the passage of time? What's the actual age of this city? Is it hundreds of years, thousands of years, more, less? We have an official history behind it. We even have an incredible astronomical clock from the Middle Ages, one of the great features. Join me as we explore 1,000 Lost Years. To understand exactly what we have in our past, though, we have to look at how we look at history. It's very important. And you may recall that we oftentimes debate about who's actually responsible for recording history. I mean, historians don't actually record history. They read past history and they interpret it. They give us the current accepted standard, which is known as official history. Although many, and in the comments section, have indicated that journalists record history, such as Ida M. Tarbell, a known muckraker. And granted, we don't have Ida M. Tarbell anymore, a reliable journalist. We have modern journalists. And it should be noted that current mainstream historians recognize that mainstream journalists don't always tell the truth, for a variety of reasons. What's the difference between historical revisionism and negationism? Is it where we just throw away books? Well, we have an official definition for it. We even have a way in which it applies to all of us. And we'll go through it because it's important to understand. Historical negationism, otherwise known as historical revisionism, first coined by Henry Rousseau as a term to describe the denial of the Holocaust. This brief uses the term historical negationism instead of revisionism for the same reason Rousseau coined it, to avoid confusing denial with legitimate, scholarly revision of contemporary understanding of history, as might happen when researchers discover new sources. So yes, it's that historical revisionism. Round and round he goes, where he ends up, no one knows. And that's exactly how it feels. Why are things always changing? What is real history? The history of negative expressions in various languages makes us witness the following curious fluctuation. The original negative adverb is first weakened, then found insufficient. And it's important to understand words and perceptions. Oddly enough, this is written by Otto Jespersen, Negation in English and Other Languages. In other words, the meaning of words themselves can be subverted, changed, and altered, and then suddenly we have the same development as the original word. So what are we really getting at? Is it very confusing? Is it difficult to know exactly when history really transpired and when we've changed and altered it? How exactly do we understand that we have 1,000 lost years, and what exactly do we mean by that? Is it just that we had 1,000 years where we didn't record history? Or are the previous 1,000 years themselves lost and subject to question? Well, if you actually look at what mainstream history tells you, it is very clear that we have a definitive written record of history, and that there are no questions or concerns about it. There is no reason why we should believe that the history that we agree upon, did we agree upon it, is the official history. And certainly people who ask questions are people who may be perceived as troublemakers. Now, imagine with me, if you will, a new development in civilization. Let's say 30 years from now, we have an entirely different civilization that develops. A new society that has different symbols, different manners of dress. In fact, entirely different social mores. For example, if you went back 100 years to the year we think of as 1923, then what exactly would you say? What would be the difference between what you see in 1923 and 2025? And of course, I avoid using the even 100 years because that's just too easy to do. Is there a reason why we always affiliate with 1,000 years? And what role do scientists and historians play in understanding what really happened? And the difference between a conspiracy and a conspiracy theory? Here we have the great Carl Sagan himself, identified as an incredible astronomer and a wonderful science communicator. And it should be noted that Carl Sagan was very adept at speaking in terms that everyone could understand. That's why he was considered a great communicator. Although there are some historians who say that his knowledge and use of history wasn't exactly, well, how shall we say, accurate. But he certainly knew about the planets, even if he never actually went to space. He didn't need to, he was that intelligent. Much in the same way that historian Mary Beard, who I acknowledge is probably one of the finest writers you would ever hope to read because her writing skills are incredibly detailed. And she's able to lay out many wonderful ideas and defend them with various forms of historical understanding, and citing the writings of the actual historians of the Roman Empire. What's intriguing, though, is that, much like Carl Sagan never went to space, and yet is an expert astronomer, Mary Beard is an expert in Roman history, though she never lived a single day in Rome and never talked to an actual Roman citizen. Now let's take this idea to a different place. Arthur C. Clarke, a science fiction author. Now, of course, you're saying, a science fiction author? What would he have to do with anything legitimate such as science or history? Well, it's intriguing to note that Arthur C. Clarke was considered a proponent for space travel. He wrote about space travel. Now, of course, you'll say it was merely speculative fiction, what would be termed science fiction. But another peculiar detail about Arthur C. Clarke, he knew a lot about space travel, or he could imagine it, but he never actually went to space. And I certainly acknowledge that many of his novels are very well written. So what do we have here? We have a model suggested by journalists and politicians to explain conspiracy theories. Social media and exposure to conspiracy theories, belief in conspiracy theories. And from journalists and politicians, it leads to illegal and dangerous behavior. And of course, it's in red to make sure that you know it is not advisable. Now, what exactly is the model suggested by empirical social scientific evidence? That just rolls right off the tongue, doesn't it? Where do the beliefs in conspiracy theories actually come from? Well, according to empirical social behavior, it's psychological motivations, political motivations, social motivations. And what exactly do those lead to? And remember, this is the official model, the same thing, illegal and dangerous behavior. So whether it's politicians, journalists, scientists, or historians analyzing it, they say it all leads to the same thing. Thinking for yourself can lead to illegal and dangerous behavior. So you've got to be very, very careful. There were also governments that engaged in it, such as the former Soviet Union. In this famous picture with Stalin, he must have had very cold hands, therefore he had to keep them warm, where we had the unfortunate individual who was completely removed from the photo. And it should be noted that this process, this, how shall we say, historical denial that transpired, is well documented and did occur. It's an example of a government, a nation state, that is engaging in, how shall we say, unscrupulous historical practices. And as a result, the official historical account becomes very obscured. Of course, we're well aware of this. Now let's take a science fiction example, the story of Dune and the character of Duncan Idaho. Duncan Idaho portrayed by actor Richard Jordan. Now, if you're familiar with David Lynch's 1984 Dune, and of course the novel by Frank Herbert, you understand that Duncan Idaho ends up playing a very critical role in the story. And I know what you're saying if you only saw the movie. Wait a minute, he died. That was the end of it, right? Well, if you're familiar with it, no, Duncan Idaho is revived. He's actually cloned and goes through a series of transitions. What are those series of transitions, and what's it really come to in the story of Dune? Duncan Idaho is a very critical character who begins to understand that the flow of history, of course this is in the Dune novels, is not exactly as is intended, that human beings have some sort of destiny. What's intriguing, though, is to think of the Jason Momoa Duncan Idaho and compare and contrast him with the Richard Jordan Duncan Idaho. They're both very intriguing characters, and I'll give Jason Momoa credit, he definitely displayed by far the most humanity in the current Dune film, in my humble opinion. Obviously, there were many deleted scenes and footage we'll never see of Richard Jordan as Duncan Idaho. I wish we could have seen the films that David Lynch wanted to make to tell the rest of the Dune story. It would have been very intriguing seeing Frank Herbert in that role, and gaining that understanding of what history really means, and how it's influencing humanity. Now back to the topic of denialism. There's an official denial that occurred in the 1950s with the rhetoric from President Dwight D. Eisenhower. During the time of the 1950s, the United States realized that they needed a rearmed Western Germany. And so as a result of this, Eisenhower softened a lot of the speeches that he made, condemning former members of the German military in World War II for the heinous acts that official history says that they committed during World War II. And as a result of this created what was called the myth of the clean German armed forces in World War II. Here's an interesting image. We have the soldiers of West Germany on the march. And yes, these are actually German soldiers, the new Bundeswehr, the German Defense Force of West Germany, and they're very obvious in American equipment. I bet they never thought that they were going to be marching or carrying weapons again. Look like a very eager bunch, don't they? It's an intriguing thought, though. And what prompted this? Well, at the time, with the Cold War on the rise, it was assessed that the NATO armies fielded needed more of a boost to actually stand against the terrifying legions of the Soviet Union. And therefore, a rearmed West Germany was the only solution imagined at that time. It was a very controversial move. And yet there was a practical reason behind it. Yes, the German army using surplus U.S. equipment. And keep in mind that during World War II, the United States provided more ammunition for the armed forces of the Soviet Union, the Red Army, than it did for its own military. How fascinating. Yes, those American surplus tanks, not the venerable great Leopard 2 tanks that the German army would be well known for. But it's very intriguing thinking of this development. Also, it's interesting to note that during the administration of Dwight D. Eisenhower, he favored what was called massive retaliation. That's massive nuclear retaliation. In fact, the United States Army during the 1950s didn't favor its infantry or armor formations, what is today called maneuver warfare. But they actually favored air defense, artillery, as the foremost branch. How different things were in the 1950s. Well, if they were going to rearm West Germany, then guess what that meant? Oh, that's a very nice and intriguing building there. During the political times, it meant that East Germany had to be rearmed by the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union didn't hesitate to do that, despite the fact that Germany was their mortal enemy and had created so much damage in their homeland. Well, that Russian officer looks particularly happy that he actually has Germans that are now fighting for him, or fighting for his side, I should say. And look at these East German soldiers. Don't they look like they're just having a grand old time? As though they never thought they were going to get out to the range again. And here they are with big smiles on their faces. And so what do we really have? The first step to prevent conspiracy theories is to know that they exist. Be aware and stop the spread. And how exactly is this supposed to be done? And who published this? What are they? The belief that events are secretly manipulated behind the scenes by powerful forces with negative intent. Nobody manipulates events behind the scenes, right? Conspiracy theories have 6 things in common: an alleged secret plot, a group of conspirators, old admirals in Starfleet, evidence that seems to support the conspiracy theory, they divide the world into good and bad, they scapegoat people and groups. Why do they flourish? They offer an explanation of events or situations which are difficult to understand. The need is heightened in times of uncertainty, like any sort of health emergency, war, or even when you can't watch your favorite sporting team. How do they take root? They start as suspicion. And then, of course, anybody can't stop conspiracy theories. And why do people spread them? Most believe they're true. And this is from our friends at the European Commission. So be sure that you keep your eyes open for conspiracy theories, because the European Commission doesn't want people thinking for themselves, or they're concerned about it. Kind of goes back to this particular, hey, who is this guy? Oh, it's Indiana Jones. I didn't recognize him without the hat, the jacket, and the whip. And he said, nothing shocks me. I'm a scientist. And nothing shocks me either, including Indiana Heston. This is Anatoly Fomenko, and he is known for positing a theory that there's over 1,000 lost years in history. And we had to understand that concept of historical revision and negation because currently, Mr. Fomenko here is considered a negationist, a denier. He is not a mainstream historian. He is a mathematician who's indulged in what are termed pseudo-historical theories. But there's an interesting idea that he brings about. What if the last 1,000 years didn't happen? What about the history of the Middle Ages? Should his writings be read? And of course, if you go off of the European Commission and if you go off of official history, absolutely not. But there's something even more interesting when we look at the mainstream view of history. This is the cosmic calendar, featured by scientist Carl Sagan in the TV series Cosmos, which he hosted and narrated. And one of the things he posited was there were billions of years of history. And yet, despite the fact that there are billions of years of history represented by these calendar months, that human history was only in the very last day, last week, or even the last 12 minutes of the last day. In other words, there are billions of years of lost history. And why is that? Because there were no humans to record it. There weren't even any journalists to write about that evolution. When humans evolved. Where were the journalists to write about it? And we have all of these incredible, majestic structures. We have structures that you can actually go and see wherever you are in the land. And we have numerous pictures of very bizarre and exotic structures in unique and random locations. Now, of course, we always have to take every single image that we see with a grain of salt, knowing that in this present era, although this is not a recent development, there exists the technology to create images, and there exists the technology to alter existing images. So you have to be careful. Is this a legitimate image that you're looking at here? Is this some kind of very, very old building where the builders apparently engaged in some unknown purpose for this device at the top? And why does it have tree branches coming out of it? Well, in addition to being artisans, they were also lovers of nature. Now, let's go back and look at the whole concept of the bastion fort, also known as the star fort or the geometrically precise foundation structure. And here we're looking at the layout and the plan of Fort Duquesne, or Pittsburgh, or whatever you want to actually call it, back during the time of the 7 Years' War, or the French Indian War, as they called it, in what would become the United States. And the explanation behind these elaborate and very beautiful bastion forts is that they were constructed for military purposes. Yes, these beautiful structures that had wonderful and incredible aesthetics to them were designed for military purposes. We even have numerous entire cities that are laid out in this same fashion. Now, this is something that we really should question, because if these were constructed for simple military purposes, then why would there be such an effort put into making them so aesthetically pleasing, into being so geometrically precise? And then even the gateways and the entryways have a very interesting and artistic layout of portals and doorways. What exact military purpose does this particular doorway serve? Well, you see, those mighty cannons couldn't blast their way through it. These structures were cannon-proof, and they also provided incredible defenses against cannon attack. And then you have these numerous walls, whether they're called Venetian walls, Aurelian walls, wonderful fortification walls. Now, a question I have for you is, how difficult would it be for us to construct such walls today? How much difficult would it be for us to build walls with bigger blocks? Yes, let's see what the military experts actually say about fixed fortifications or bastion forts. Here's one of the foremost experts, George S. Patton, a master in maneuver warfare from the United States Army. And I'll say it in his high-pitched voice: fixed fortifications are a monument to the stupidity of man. Wait a minute, what's that you're saying? George S. Patton had a high-pitched voice? Yes, actually he did. But we oftentimes confuse with actor George C. Scott, the Missourian, and his gravelly voice. Fixed fortifications are a monument to the stupidity of man. Isn't it interesting to think about that perception? Now, no one did that intentionally. Patton was a great movie from 1970. And it was during a time when the United States military was going through, well, just a lot of criticism. What about these current areas that we see that are dugout berms? This is done by a D7 dozer. Did some charlatans sell to all these lords of the Middle Ages that they could build these bastion forts utilizing labor and tying up very essential resources for years? Or is there some other explanation behind the bastion forts? Here you have the classic mass-produced World War II barracks by the United States. And remember, we're well aware of the achievements of the United States during World War II. Well, these were structures that they rapidly built so soldiers would have a roof over their head when they were training. And then let's not forget that the United States is also the same nation that completed the incredible construction feat of building 24 fleet carriers, or Essex-class carriers. Prior to World War II, the Royal Navy of the United Kingdom was considered the greatest navy in the land. But after World War II, it would be the United States Navy, with its now currently called carrier strike groups. So what's really the truth then behind this incredible history that we have? What actually happened? Were there really incredible forts and fortifications that there were no means to destroy during the Middle Ages and the late Renaissance and up to the 1700s? Or is there an entirely different explanation for it? Even looking at the grand history of the so-called cosmos, the theory being that everything originates from a single point known as the Big Bang. It's a theory, although I would say if someone presented a theory as a fact, that might be disingenuous. That if they said something that was a theory was a fact, might be engaging in some form of, dare I say, denialism? I guess you could call it revision, but, we have different experts for different things. Scientists can tell you what happened scientifically, and historians actually tell you what happened in the past. What exactly does this picture represent, and who is this individual? Quite an interesting head that they have. And what happened after the fall of the Roman Empire? We have Clovis, king of the Franks, in 481. We don't even mention that terrible year 536 in this timeline. The Battle of Tours, which prevented the spread of Islam into Europe. So the official history says, although revisionist history says it was merely a raid and the battle wasn't all that decisive. The reign of Charlemagne, Charles the Great, the Holy Roman Emperor of the Carolingian Empire. And then 832, the Vikings invade. And that's about all you really need to know. Which Vikings are we talking about? Are we talking about the Lee Majors Vikings, or are we talking about the more current Vikings who have the shaved head? And the rule of Charlemagne was something that always interested me. Yes, here we have this image of Charlemagne where he kind of looks like Santa Claus with a very elaborate crown on his head. But even questioning the existence of Charlemagne is something that'll only get you in a lot of trouble. It's very clear that Charlemagne, or Charles the Great, yes, we go back and forth on how to actually say the name, because is it the Gaelic version of Charles? Is it the French version of Charles? Is it the English version of Charles? By the way, did they ever actually call it the Carolingian Empire, or was that a name that we assigned later? And now you start to see the issue that we have with our understanding of history. There's so many times that we assign terms later, after the fact, that we don't seem to have an actual understanding. And so, if we're referring to something as the Byzantine Empire, even though that empire did not call themselves the Byzantine Empire, then is that legitimate history? Or is that, how shall we say, a historical assignment? Are we not being true to the understanding of history? And that's really the question I want to pose. If we have an entire empire that existed for 1,000 years, and we're giving it the wrong name, then is that not the very beginning of losing 1,000 years? Because what name did they actually call it? And what's the truth behind the Holy Roman Empire? A Holy Roman Empire that didn't actually have anything to do with Rome. It was actually what would become the nation-state of Germany later. Why did they have the two-headed eagle? What exactly did it represent? Why would a nation adopt anything with a two-headed anything? It's very odd. There's the reference to the Western and the Eastern Roman Empire. The Eastern Roman Empire would survive. The Western Roman Empire was sacked and fell. The last Roman emperor in the Western Roman Empire, Romulus Augustus, and the Eastern Roman Empire enduring, as we call the Byzantine Empire. And whatever happened to the Huns? Well, they just kind of broke up and stopped doing their raids. You can even look in later eras of history, such as the rule of Otto the Great, and one of the founding powers of the Holy Roman Empire. And here you'll see that he's titled Otto Rex, or Otto Rex, King Otto. Quite elaborate headdress. And here we have this little relief, if you will, of Otto presenting a castle, a church, a cathedral to Jesus Christ himself. And Otto is depicted in a very, very small format because it's to show humility in the presence of Jesus and the saints. Well, how very pious of him. There's other historical questions that we have, though, such as the existence of figures like Joan of Arc. Now, I remember when I was teaching medieval history, there was quite an argument amongst the professors. Nobody argued if Joan of Arc existed, of course, but the role that she actually played in turning the tide for the 100 Years' War with France against England. Was Joan of Arc a general, a commander for the French army, or was she merely a standard bearer? In all the depictions, she's always armed, which is quite fascinating, although you could make the argument that a standard bearer needs to be armed. You can't have the enemy capturing the standard. But it's yet another example of a woman taking a leadership role and being remembered by history. And there are many other examples. Irene, Elizabeth, and the names go on and on. It seems to run counter to what our understanding was of the stated historical role of women in history. And so it creates a lot of questions. I mean, what exactly is the role of these interesting hats that these individuals are wearing? And what is the truth behind the bubonic plague? We're to understand that nearly half the population of Europe perished in a very short amount of time, that the reason that this plague was so devastating was that prior to the plague, the nations of Europe were experiencing a famine. And so they were already weakened by famine, and then the plague destroyed many others. Is that what happened? Or is it merely an explanation for a different series of events? The challenge that we have is that there is no one that we can actually talk to who experienced these events. We have to trust, and it doesn't matter what your view is on history, whether you're Mary Beard, Carl Sagan, or Lucius Aurelian, or whoever, we have to trust those who recorded it, and trust that they recorded it properly. Not only that, but we also have to trust the chain of custody with the recorded documents. We have to trust the fact that when they were translated from different languages between different nations, different empires, that they were recorded properly. Why do we have a catacomb of so many bones below Paris, France? How many bones of how many individuals are down there? Millions? I suppose it depends on who you ask. And where did these bones come from? Why would these bones be arranged in this format? How exactly does this reflect the values at the time of Christianity, which was the only known religion in Europe at the time? Although there were others, such as the Gnostics, but the Gnostics were completely destroyed during the so-called Albigensian Crusades. Are all these structures exactly constructed in the way that we think that they are? Some with construction timelines of hundreds of years? And by the way, does anybody know what structure in the United States where you see this same geometric precision that you see on the ceiling of this incredible cathedral? And I'll give you a hint, it's not a cathedral in the United States. It has a very different purpose. And yet you'll find many structures that reflect this geometric precision. What's really the truth behind this rule that we have of all these kings and queens and all the concepts of feudalism? And the other question I have that we should consider is, why is it that we put such priority on the royalty, but who else do we remember? For example, we have very well-tracked lineages, very well-tracked family trees. Is it a coincidence then that in many of our high fantasy novels, you'll also see family trees and lineages? And do we actually have legitimate lineages of family names for commoners, for peasants, which as we understand it, was essentially 99% of the population in Europe, those who worked the land, or the serfs, or the lower class. So why exactly would we have a very profound and accurate family record? I mean, they were just part of the resources tied to the land. Yes, it was a form of forced labor. But if you were just barely being able to make ends meet with producing food, then how could you reassign half the population to construct these elaborate bastion forts? How would they even have the knowledge to construct them? You might have an engineer such as Balian of Ibelin on hand, who looks a lot like Orlando Bloom, but you just wouldn't have the actual manpower to construct these structures. And what's the reality behind the Byzantine Empire? Did Justinian really exist in the way that we think that he did? Is this what he looked like? And what about his general who is forgotten, Belisarius? Is this what he looked like? We don't know for sure if this is Belisarius. Or is it Belrios? If anybody gets that reference, let me know. And of course, even the existence of Otto Rex, the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. Well, we have a coin of him, so he must have existed, right? What exactly is going on with his face when you look closely at this coin? I don't know, maybe it's just eroded to the forces of time. But we look at all of these incredible family trees and these records and these lineages that we have. And it becomes a lot easier to have a royal family assigned for each nation. I mean, a royal family that's recorded and tracked for each nation. But what about the rest of the population? For example, on my mother's side, we can trace our family name all the way back to the 1400s. But the only thing we have is just a list of names and dates. We don't have exact locations where they lived, and we certainly don't know what their deeds were, their professions, or any other details about their life. It's very peculiar. So what really was going on in this last 1,000 years? Is it exactly as history tracked it? Or are there a few things that aren't exactly as we'd have them believe. Not because there's a conspiracy, not because anyone's trying to mislead anyone, but simply because along the way, perhaps some unscrupulous power changed the records. I mean, it is well documented that we have corrupt governments that would do that. Not our current governments, of course, but governments in the past. And what's the reality behind this incredible crown of the Holy Roman Emperor? I remember when I first saw it and I made an offhand comment that it kind of reminded me of that crown I could snag at Burger King back in the day. This was a long time ago, but I don't know. What are your thoughts on this? Did we lose 1,000 years, or is history as we remember it? Join me for another look at history. Welcome to the Restitutor Orbis channel. Our mainstream account tells us that in the earliest days of our civilization we built pyramids during the Bronze Age. After the Bronze Age, we slowly advanced to the time of the Roman Republic that eventually became the Roman Empire, and the sort of structures that we built changed radically. We advanced to building smaller structures that were not quite as geometrically precise as the earlier pyramids, and yet they're very fine structures with great domes and magnificent colossal forms to them that endure to this day. And let's also take time to appreciate the wondrous Roman roads, many of which that also continue to endure to this day. Everywhere we go around the land, we'll see the ruins of the previous civilization. And yes, that includes the United States and the Americas, even though it's called the New World. Although new as opposed to what is certainly a question of the day. Today we're going to examine the 5 eras theory. The channel originally started with the charter of examining numerous different theories. And you can go back and watch the video that's linked in the description of this video called The Grand Theories of Tartaria and the Old World, in which we explored the many different theories that could explain the existence of pre-existing civilizations that were not explained in the mainstream. Think about the aspect of a cemetery. You believe that a cemetery gives you validation that the history that you're told is accurate because every time someone you know passes away, they're buried in a cemetery with a date that's left on the tombstone. Therefore, older tombstones must be validation that what happened in the past and the past historical account is accurate. Although would you be surprised to know that virtually every cemetery across the lands has been moved at some point in time for a variety of reasons. We have now advanced to building wondrous towers of glass and steel that cross the land. And yet, can we actually build these incredible pyramids that we did in the distant past during the Bronze Age? How does the mainstream account explain the construction of these pyramids? Indeed, we are derided for even questioning the account that we're given for how the pyramids were constructed. We are derided and told that it's merely a conspiracy theory. Yet at the same time, the mainstream tries to explain the pyramids with theories. In other words, they don't know for sure. But it's okay for them to come up with theories because their theories are validated by scientists, historians, archaeologists, and all the individuals with the appropriate credentials to do such things. So you look at the pyramids and you'll see that it's made up of many large stones that had to be moved. And they explain this by telling us that the quarries were nearby. They also have these wondrous images that we have that show human labor moving these great blocks. And then we have these beautiful animations that show us how they used a wonderful waterworks project to move these blocks and set them in place. And doesn't that illustration look great of those giant colossal people? And when you look at these illustrations and you have this wonderful account that tells you that water may have moved the blocks in place with human labor, it suddenly seems very believable, and you'll just accept it without asking questions. Of course, this image looks ridiculous. We could never build the pyramids like this today. So if we can't do it with human labor, and we base everything on this supposed representation from a governor of Egypt that existed 2,000 years before the year 0, or so we're told, and then it was some Greek individual who came up with a theory on how they moved the blocks using ramps, even though he was theorizing about an event that occurred 2,000 years before he was alive, and then this Greek individual is also 2,000 years before our current time, I don't see any issues with the mainstream account of the pyramids. Now, if you want a different theory, we're going to examine the 5 eras theory. The 5 eras theory examines the fact that there are civilizations that came before ours that we don't discuss, that the mainstream does not acknowledge. And the reason for that being is that because if you actually acknowledge the existence of other civilizations where people lived in a different fashion, then it completely detracts from your ability to maintain your control over the population. The eras that we talk about the most and we'll examine on the channel are the contemporary era, our current era, the fifth era, and the fourth era, or also known as the Tartarian era or the Monument era. These are the most dramatic eras to talk about, and we also have the most evidence. But we're also going to consider the foundation eras, the first through the third eras. And we call them the foundation eras because they were the original foundations that both the fourth era and the fifth era were built on top of. And we can still see their remnants. Indeed, we speculate that the pyramids are actually the remnants of the second era civilization, or the foundation era. And yet there are other examples of incredible geometric structures that endure. Consider what we have in the fifth era with our great cities of glass and steel, and yet something about them seems very disposable and uninspired. What's the primary form of architecture? We have nothing but wonderful brutalist architecture. Brutalist architecture, called as such because it is functional, and it's also cost-effective. What's truly intriguing to consider, though, about the prospect of brutalist architecture is how it's risen across the world, and its heyday was considered after World War II in both the United States and the Soviet Union. And despite the fact that these were two diametrically opposed ideologies and nations, for a variety of reasons, they somehow embraced the same type of architecture. Supposedly at different times and for different reasons that happen to support their respective economic systems. Even in Pittsburgh, where we saw the beautiful Cathedral of Learning, we have this wonderful glass tower that we can look at and we can act like it really compares with the Cathedral of Learning. And then we have many other wondrous structures where great residences live in. It looks nice and rounded and cubed and very, very boring. Sometimes you have to remember, though, that there is inspired architecture in brutalist architecture. It looks like we have what appears to be some sort of broken down TIE fighter here. And what does it represent? I don't know. Looking at the rest of the architecture, you need go no further than consider the dystopian film A Clockwork Orange. A Clockwork Orange, which talked about how a society repressed and controlled an individual, and it used this architecture quite effectively to show how individuals were controlled and how ultimately the violence that was inflicted on others was all at the behest of the government. And if you pay attention to the subtext in the movie A Clockwork Orange, you'll see that the architecture plays no small part in representing that. And there's no doubt about it that brutalist architecture can certainly reflect a dystopian flavor to a society, if you will. Now, is this going a little too far? Is this being a little too harsh on brutalist architecture? It has its place, it's functional, and it's cheap. At least that's what we'll be told. Although there are conflicting accounts given as to why it was embraced. For example, you'll be told that in the Western world, the United States, brutalist architecture was embraced because it was cheaper, and there was a demand for residences. And then in the Soviet Union, or the so-called communist bloc at the time, you'll be told that brutalist architecture was embraced because it was all for the good of the state, and it was for allowing individuals and workers to all have the same standard of living. And as much as we believe both of these diametrically opposed ideologies embracing the exact same architecture as the main reason for why we have numerous examples of brutalist architecture, we see that it represents the fifth era. And in fact, many offshoots of what they used to call brutalist architecture still exist to this day. And you need look no further in the United States than a Holiday Inn Express or any of these newer modern hotels or residential areas, where you can find that it's not really dystopian living, it's merely common sense. It makes perfect sense. It's cheaper. And it's always good to have disposable buildings. It's also good to have buildings with the fine functional lines of brutalism in the background for when you're engaging on your individual walks for fun. But why is brutalist architecture considered something that's an advancement? For two reasons. One, we're told that it reflected the economic realities in the entire world from the 1950s to the 1970s. And two, we're just told that it's a lot more practical. We don't want to build architecture that has an artistic appeal to it. Practicality, cost savings, and being economically viable. That's what really matters. And when you have a lot of people that need housing, you're going to shove them in very block-like housing units that all look the same. And this will inspire people. And indeed, the actual housing units that were used to film A Clockwork Orange still have that same dystopian look to them in the present. Now, it's my opinion. Perhaps this is a utopian appearance to you. Perhaps you think that that beautiful Freedom Tower in New York City is an improvement over the structures that preceded it. We've looked at the skyline of New York City in the early 20th century. And tell me, is there a comparison? Do any of these many residential high-rises actually compare to the previous residences that we had all over the Western world and the Eastern world from the times past? We'll be told that this was merely a necessity, that this was done for the good of people, that this represented the will of the people, not just in the United States, but in the Soviet Union. Now let's look at the Art Deco question. Is Art Deco from the 5th era or the 4th era? Art Deco is very intriguing because it has conflicting accounts for what it really represents. It has conflicting accounts for what styles actually go into Art Deco. When we look at Art Deco, though, we see something very different than brutalist or postmodern. We see an architectural style that reflects artistic inspiration, something that reflects a civilization that genuinely cares about the structures that it's building, that the structures are supposed to have more of a function than just be utilitarian, as we're relentlessly told that brutalist architecture serves. We see a style and a beauty in these Art Deco buildings that seem to speak to the human spirit. When you look at these buildings, you can't help but be impressed, and you feel that a lot more effort was put into their exterior and interior designs. You actually see the fact that there is the true human spirit that's reflected in these buildings. And oftentimes people will try to convince you that these buildings were all easily built primarily in the United States during the 1920s, and you can even find a great example of one built in the Soviet Union in the 1940s to the early 1950s. Yet, looking at the Art Deco style, you can see that there is something about it that is always awe-inspiring. And it's very difficult to accept the explanation that all these buildings were built with these very wonderful and convincing construction photos that we have. And even though this was only about 100 years ago, it still falls in a very ambiguous time. Did our civilization build these buildings? Or are we simply told that they built these buildings? How much of a deception do we have with the actual timeline? And can we really validate or verify anything? Now, it's very interesting to me because since I've done many of these explorations and we've primarily looked at many cities in the United States, we've started to look at cities in Europe and in Asia, we always have the same explanation and always have the same things that you see in the comments. And I'm going to let you in on something. There's actually a comment somebody could make that would convince me over 90% that any one of these Art Deco buildings were built by our civilization. But it's quite fascinating that not a single person has ever made that comment. And it's really quite simple, and I'm not going to tell you what that comment is. I'll let you know if somebody makes the comment, but you can find an example of it in one of the videos concerning an Iowa exploration because somebody made a comment that very convincingly showed that the 801 Grand Building in Des Moines was built by our civilization. And yet there's so many questions that come up with these Art Deco buildings. They continue to show the aspect of the civilization that preceded ours. I believe that by and large, most of these structures are from the 4th era, or the Tartarian civilization that preceded our 5th era. And why do I think that? Because these buildings do reflect the style of what we would call the Old World. They have that artistic spirit, that inspiration in every single one of them. And it's not just on the exteriors of the buildings, it's also in the interior where you see how they reflect the once grandeur of civilization. A civilization that cared about the individual, not constantly being in a state of function or a state of misery, but being able to inspire the spirit on the inside. No doubt when you're in an Art Deco building as opposed to when you're in a brutalist architecture building, you can tell the difference. You can also compare and contrast how you feel when you stand outside an Art Deco building as opposed to a brutalist building. And when you see some of the examples of Art Deco, the explanation you'll be given from architects is that they had more of an artistic flair in the 1920s to incorporate all these incredible styles that even include Egyptian, strangely enough, because we do recall the civil courts building in St. Louis that we looked at that was modeled after the mausoleum of Helicanarsis, which supposedly doesn't have anything to do with Egypt, but it does. And that's according to the mainstream account. There's always these beautiful reliefs that also accompany Art Deco. The wondrous figures that you see depicted on the outside of the buildings. And these buildings have many different functions. Some are office buildings, some are municipal buildings, some are memorials, yet the style is reflected in the same. And while they try to tell us exactly what it's supposed to reflect, and of course they give us the hand wave explanation that the reason it reflects every civilization and culture across the world is because, of course, it incorporates every civilization and culture across the world. That's how you explain Art Deco. It's not because it's actually from a civilization that encompassed all the known lands. It's because somebody was trying to achieve cultural understanding in the 1920s, especially in the United States. The interiors of some of these buildings continue to inspire us. Now, why do I acknowledge the fact that some of these buildings may be questionable? Because we constantly run across the situation where we're told, we are assured in the same manner with repeated statements that many of these buildings, and here we look at the main building of the Moscow University, a questionable building, we're told that this individual, Joseph Stalin, was responsible for its construction. And once Joseph Stalin had passed on, then the Soviet Union completely embraced brutalist architecture. Indeed, it's an individual that we always explain it. Remember during the Kansas City exploration where we saw some very stunning Art Deco buildings, including the Power and Light building in the aptly named Power and Light District within Kansas City. I would be interested to see someone actually be able to build a building like this today. I would like to see someone build this very impressive theater that still endures with this very unique dome. Again in Kansas City, interesting patterns that we see in the windows, and of course the type of construction material that was used to establish the walls and the dome itself. And let's not forget the Kansas City Hall. The Kansas City Hall also being a stellar example of Art Deco. And where do you see it? You see it in the art reliefs, and you also see it in the walls of the building going all the way to the top. So you can prove that there is a skyscraper that's a lot more than just a functional building. You can see there are aspects of it that truly reflect a different civilization, unless we're to believe it's our own civilization. Kansas City has its own version of Joseph Stalin, Tom Pendergast. Tom Pendergast, who was a mafia and political machine organizer in Kansas City and supposedly responsible for the presidency of Harry S. Truman. Of course, it didn't save this particular individual from serving time in prison for tax evasion. So really, was Joseph Stalin and Tom Pendergast responsible for the Art Deco buildings, or were they just the people that we say are responsible? We have many photos of the construction of the Art Deco buildings, and supposedly we have many accounts. Although, oddly enough, no one seems to provide a first-person account. And now let's consider the Fourth Era proper. This is the era that we call the Tartarian era. This is the civilization that preceded ours. There was a hard reset that occurred in a time frame from 1750 to 1850, although it's hard to say for sure. We have wondrous examples of what the Tartarian civilization may have looked like. Very incredible architecture, stretching to the sky, various forms of producing power. We've explored it in great detail about how this pre-existing civilization managed to achieve a balance between both nature and the artificial implements of its civilization. It also managed to achieve the very elusive balance, for a time, between the individual and society. And that's something that our current civilization tends to go away from in every direction that you can imagine, especially given the fact that it oftentimes defaults to extreme polarizations and someone always having to be right and someone always having to be wrong. And you always have to embrace a belief now, and it's completely wrong to remain undecided about something. We'll still see examples of this Tartarian civilization even in some older images that we have, such as this image that may or may not have problems with it, of an airship docking with the Empire State Building. We also have other examples of airships docking with various towers. So is this really a brief technological fad according to our mainstream account? Or was this a real technological advancement that carried over from the Fourth Era civilization that had to be removed? We've looked at many examples of buildings that still stand to this day that we suspect are from this pre-existing civilization. Consider the Art Deco buildings that we looked at that are very likely from the Fourth Era civilization. We've also explored many libraries and municipal buildings in many cities, such as Terminal Tower in Cleveland. And many people will insist that they have numerous accounts, or because they worked a job in the building, that they can prove that it was constructed by our civilization, even though all we have are some very difficult to interpret images. And once again, we have, strangely enough, no first-hand accounts. Well, I understand the 1930s was a long time ago. And again, we have other images of this terminal tower. And many people will say that they just know, or they know someone who knows someone who knows someone, and that's what they'll say. And if that's good enough for you with the historical account, then by all means accept it. But yet you have many other structures that also seem to defy simple explanation by their incredible architectural style, and all supposedly built during the same time, such as the Masonic Temple in Detroit that we explored, another wonder of the 1920s when it seemed as though they built 75% of the buildings in every major city in the Midwest of the United States. We do have a construction photo of it, and once again we see that there are no issues with this construction photo. It is very convincing, and of course that's usually what you'll have when you explore these structures. Remember the wondrous interior that we looked at. And again, I believe this interior gives us true evidence of a pre-existing civilization that has been repurposed and used by the organizations in our current civilization. And here you look at this theater in the same structure, and again, a very impressive and beautiful theater. Certainly there's nothing that we've built since the 1960s that remotely compares to this. This impressive structure in Cincinnati that will be told is an arch or waterworks, it is most certainly not a castle, because somebody says so. And in Cincinnati, where we have this impressive church from the 1840s next to the city hall. And of course, the explanation will be given is that we had those crafty Germans that could build in Greco-Roman style and lay out a wonderful church like this in the 1840s with very impressive columns and the roof that we've seen. And there's absolutely no question about this. You just accept it. Or you can ask questions, such as looking at the Fox Theater in Atlanta, and realize that perhaps all the explanations that were given for who was truly responsible for these structures is not as simple or as cut and dry as it seems. Indeed, looking at the Fulton County Prison in Atlanta, or near what would become Atlanta, we can see evidence of a different civilization. Don't even bother asking why you'd need a tower on a prison like that, because it makes perfect sense. And now we look at the Foundation eras, the third to the first era. Now the Foundation eras may not seem as dramatic as either the Tartarian era or the Contemporary era because we don't have as much direct evidence. But we still have a lot of direct evidence that indicates that there was an era that preceded the civilization that came before us. And this is in the many examples that we have of what we call star forts, or as this channel refers to them now, geometrically precise foundation structures. And the reason we call them geometrically precise foundation structures on this channel is because they are very geometrically precise. We can tell that these are artificial constructs. And in every major city, there is some sort of documentation that indicates that there is a geometrically precise foundation structure that surrounds the city. And quite impressively so, we can find it in cities across the land. In cities in the United States, in Germany, in Russia, the former Soviet Union, across many other lands. And the explanation will be given for these geometrically precise foundation structures that surround the entire city is because it was good practice. They were defensible. It's how you would defend against cannonballs. And yet, conversely, you can find some structures that had signs of these geometrically precise foundation structures, or the smaller star forts, as you will, during the United States Civil War, which, strangely enough, were overrun or overtaken by a direct tactical military assault. So it's very strange. Once again, it's the example of a conflicting account. Now you might be thinking, okay, that's fine, you have these maps, and yes, perhaps they were just drawn, and yet we do have actual imagery that shows that these geometrically precise foundation structures at that scale are quite real. There are many examples of them across the entire land. And you can find them around cities, around old fortresses, or at least what we're told are old fortresses or castles, as there are so many castles, since everybody seemed to be able to afford to build one during what were called medieval times. And yet you can see the geometrical precision, and you can see the amalgamation of artificial with the natural. And perhaps this is also the explanation for the large and long, numerous so-called sandbars that we have that run for miles, and in some cases 40 to 50 miles. And you can also see the precision within the remaining structures. There are so many examples of these geometrically precise foundation structures that we can't simply explain, surrounding small towns, surrounding cities, the remnants of what used to be walls. Yet it's integrated with the terrain. And we can also tell that there are buildings that were built on top of these structures in the past. And that's where we get the title the Foundation Era from. It was the third era that the foundation that our previous civilization, the Tartarian era, and then our current era, built on top of, or in lieu of. And when you can see this across the land, and you can see so many examples, it completely contradicts the mainstream account that we're given. Also the fact that it's overgrown and it's integrated with nature. Now, of course, people say, well, there's a reason for it. It was just built before, and it was done with the ability to build walls because there were so many skilled construction individuals during the Middle Ages all the way up to the 1700s. And building these forts, regardless of logistical challenges, were never an issue. In fact, logistics is one of the greatest aspects that's hand-waved away. Now, they explain it with the Egyptian pyramids by saying that the quarry was right there. Well, it doesn't matter if the quarry was right next to the pyramids, which they try to tell us or imply that it was. You still have to cut all those blocks. You still have to move all those blocks, and you still have to form the pyramids, much as you have to form the land and the artificial structures of this geometrically precise foundation structure that goes around what appears to be the settlement and this structure. So is it really that simple to explain, or is it just a matter of accepting what you're told because it's the path of least resistance? And oftentimes that's what we find ourselves doing. And if you assess that's what you need to do to achieve happiness in your life is simply to capitulate to the will of others, then so be it. The second era gives us the example of where we have the pyramids from, and it no doubt reached heights that we can only begin to dream of. Now we suspect that there are a few remnants of the second era. We're told by the very same mainstream account that tells us of how the pyramids were constructed that they once had even more beauty to them, that they once appeared to have a great outer structure. But also imagine if they had this ability to build pyramids, what could they have achieved and how many ubiquitous structures could they have built using the geometric precision of pyramids? You also have to think in a much larger scale too, because while people will try to say that we never achieved a great building scale, yet we're still able to conceive a larger building scale. In other words, imagine pyramids that would start to match the size of hills or even small mountains, and then integrate a technological component with them. Integrate the aspect of power resources. And when you look inside the existing pyramids that remain, you see a very complicated architecture that went into establishing them. And of course we're told, well, it's because it was a tomb and the pharaoh liked their pyramids and they wanted to have a very elaborate tomb. And the thought of rebellion because they were facing death never crossed anyone's minds. Well, except for a few select individuals. But what if it was very different? What if this was a civilization that existed in even more balance between the individual and the society, and it achieved even more balance between nature and the artificial? And what if what we refer to as the Mayan civilization was actually just a component of the second era civilization? What if all the descendants that came from it and its long timeline actually came from the second era? Think on this. Instead of this being a less advanced civilization, this was a far more advanced civilization. Again, it flies right in the face of what we're given from the mainstream account that provides us depictions such as this. And depictions such as this, even though no one will ever do a practical experiment to prove how possible this is, that will convince us that this was how the pyramids were built. But what if they had construction techniques that we have absolutely no knowledge of? The ability to produce construction materials that far exceed anything we can begin to imagine. And we're not even talking about the original Rossendale cement, or the Rossendale concrete as we called it, or the Roman concrete. We're talking about something even more advanced than that. And here we have the depiction that shows us what the original pyramids supposedly looked like. And there's no doubt that they had this level of grandeur. Perhaps they had even more grandeur. Maybe they were coated in something that looked like gold. We'll still certainly consider all the other theories that we have, even though the five eras theory seems to be quite solid, at least from our observations. The important thing is that we retain open minds. While we're visualizing what the previous eras, especially the foundation eras, may have appeared like, what we're going off of for our evidence is some of the foundation rocks that we have, many of the other impressive structures that no doubt existed in these previous civilizations. What we see remain are not the full structures in their glory. we see the smaller structures that have somehow survived the passage of time and at least 2, perhaps 3 resets. And something else I'll concede with this 5 eras theory. For all we know, there could have been many more eras. There could have been 10, there could have been 20, there could have been 30, or even 100. And another question might be, well, how exactly does other timelines fit into this 5 eras theory? Well, when you consider the fact that San Francisco is considered to be one of the most exquisite cities of our current civilization, and yet nothing about it even compares with what we had in the past. Finally, let's consider the first era. The first era seems to be the era that we have the greatest difficulty imagining. And the reason for that is because the first era, no doubt, reflected the greatest balance. It's safe to say that a lot of what we have in our current civilization encourages us not to ever believe that there were buildings that were the size of mountains, even though we're told that in the future we'll envision buildings that are the size of mountains, and architects supposedly already have. Or did they derive this inspiration from something that existed in the past and was described in the past? Described in many different old accounts of structures that were so large that they actually exceeded the size of mountains. We even have the account of the Beacon of Progress, supposedly just a drawing, a sketch, a concept for an incredible monument that was going to be reflected in the Chicago World's Fair, along with many other wondrous structures. We also have the religious accounts of the great religions of the land that tell us of great cities and celestial kingdoms in the past. Are they really referring to the actual celestial kingdom? Or are they referring to cities that may have existed? Cities in the distant past that really were of a grander and greater glory than we can ever imagine. Because we had a civilization of individuals that had achieved balance between both their individual desires and the needs and wants of a society. You might look at rock faces such as this and you would think, no, it's merely a natural formation. Or perhaps it reflects some sort of old, large tree. And perhaps it does. However, there's another approach that you could say it reflects a once great and amazing structure that's been through 4 or 5 hard resets, or maybe more. The difficult thing about envisioning the first era is the fact that we've had many resets and it's been a long time. Now, how long is that exactly? The main question might be, how many years do I envision in these 5 eras total? Well, we just don't know, and I know that's not the answer that anybody would want, but that's the honest answer, because we talked about in the date paradox how we don't know how many years have passed. We don't know how many years are in each of these eras. 1,000 years? 5,000 years? 5 million years? Could the entire 5 eras only be 6,000 years? Or could it be many more, 600,000 years? Is it a millennial reign of only 1,000 years, or is it a millennial reign of 1,000 centuries? Or even a far greater amount of time? We just don't know. And the difficult thing with considering time is how quickly things can become obscured, where we're reliant on other people, governments, institutions that were told relentlessly by other historical authorities that were corrupt, that were, excuse the pun, evil. Evil in every way, shape, and form, and yet we're supposed to believe that they preserved an accurate account of history to hand down to us? Because even if you prescribe to the mindset that all of our current governments and civilizations are completely incorruptible and everything they do is for the good and represents the will of the people, regardless of national divisions that we're constantly given, how exactly can you accept the fact that previous civilizations and governments that existed handed us an honest account? I suppose what I'm saying is the 5 eras theory is the best way that we can visualize what may have come before. And I'm always open to revising it and reconsidering it. And as we continue our explorations, we're going to primarily consider the 5 eras theory, because it does seem to explain a lot of the inconsistencies that we have. Now, if you want to reference one particular publication, one particular guide, or what one certain researcher says, that's completely up to you. And I completely request that everybody in the comments tell me what your honest thoughts are. What do you believe? Where do you think the 5 eras fits into the actual history? Is it honest? Is it accurate? Or do we have other difficulties? Do we have other complexities that we need to consider within what the actual timeline is? The last thing I'm ever going to do, though, is simply give up and stop asking questions and stop exploring. because we've already learned so much, and we've already learned to see the world in a very different way. And of course, there's going to be people, there'll even be institutions that'll tell us that we shouldn't see the world in this way. What did the collapse of the First Era really look like? We can imagine it. We can believe it was brought about by some hard natural force, or maybe it was brought about by a natural force and the internal corruption of the people on a long enough timeline. It is indeed a recurring theme in virtually every cultural and religious account that we have in our modern era. Consider what was really lost in the past. And I think that's the greatest theme of this research going forward, and this is why this is a very exciting exploration that we continue. As we go forward, all these theories are just as valid as any other theory, and I don't really have any evidence that discounts any particular theory. Although I will admit it's very difficult to prove the theory that everything is just exactly as we're told it is, and history is exactly correct in every minute detail, even though we relentlessly discuss the problems with that. Well, thank you for joining me. I hope you enjoyed this exploration of the 5 eras. Please like, comment, and subscribe. Greetings, everyone, and welcome to the weekly live stream for the Restitutor Orbis channel. I'm your host, Lucius Aurelian, and thank you for joining us as we continue our exploration of the 5 eras, the alternate timeline. And I'd like to extend a great warm welcome to all Prime Explorers, viewers, and all others joining us. The intention behind this exploration is I'd received several requests to give my idea in terms of how much time I think may have passed in each era. Now, there's a little bit of a pre-note, or at least a precursor note, I want everybody to be aware of. This is all entirely speculation, and we'll talk about why it is, especially as we go further back in time. And that's an honest assessment for me. The further you go back in time, the more difficult it becomes to really know exactly what the specific events were, to include the sequence and the chronology. And if anybody tells you otherwise, then it's a confidence trick. But let's really talk about that. Let's talk about time and perception to get started. Now, does anybody know what we're looking at here in this initial image? Does anybody know where this is? I have a feeling somebody knows what we're looking at. And yes, this has been explored before on the channel. Come on now. I know you want to say it. Kitch, Casey, come on. All right. Well, it is the Liberty Memorial in Kansas City, Kansas, and it has been explored before. Now, the interesting thing about the Liberty Memorial, yeah, there you go, Casey. There you go. Liberty Memorial, Liberty Tower. Interestingly enough, constructed in the 1920s, thanks to donations collected from the good people of Kansas City to memorialize the dead of World War I. That's what its stated intention is, and we have some confidence that it was constructed or completed in the 1920s. Although, do we? It has some rather interesting symbols with it, such as what may be sphinxes or maybe something else. I don't know. Lions, griffins, whatever you think they may be. You also have the tower itself, which has these very intriguing guardian figures on them, which have absolutely nothing to do with World War I, but that's all right. Maybe they were just diving into the symbolism, and that's all good and well. You also have the fact that below it, in this subterranean complex here, is the actual World War I museum. And then beyond it, you have Union Station, the incredible train station that was constructed earlier in the early 19-teens in Kansas City. All the exceptional Art Deco buildings that still survive to this day. And then behind it here, you have this unnamed building, which we're not going to talk about. Although I will say it was implied that Snake Plissken was in that building in the deleted scene from Escape from New York. Because remember, he started in Kansas City. Anyways, so a lot of significance behind this, but what are we really getting at? Well, we're informed that it was constructed in 1920. And here's the image of the great heroes of World War I, all the great generals, although quite interesting in contrast to what we have in modern military affairs. The American general, John J. Pershing, is actually standing in the back, but maybe he was a little bit more of a modest character at that time. But yes, all the talk about World War I, and Isn't this interesting? This symbolism that we have. Why do we keep seeing this everywhere? I don't know what it means, and I'm not going to speculate right now because we're talking about 5 eras. And we're talking about how confident we are that this monument was truly constructed in the 1920s, as we were informed. And that's why we've explored it many times. And we do have construction photos. I like how they just wrote on marker here. It looks like a Sharpie. You ever hear actor Peter Weller complain about Sharpies when he's signing autographs? It's really hilarious. March 19th, 1925. Now, what are your thoughts on this very interesting construction photo from 1925? And keep in mind, this is not even 100 years ago. This is 99 years ago. How confident are you in this photo? How confident that what you're seeing in this image is what's really happening at the time stated? And keep in mind, if this date was not Sharpied here on this photo, and remember, you're not looking at the original photo, and remember that the photo is just a photo. It is not the actual object itself at that time. I think that's something we forget. Even if you have a hard copy of the photo in your hand, it is not the actual object in that time. It is a representation of it. Now, of course, we'll take this to its logical conclusion. You are looking at a digital projection of that image that has been copied, and it's a copy of a copy of a copy. In other words, it's not authentic. It's not the authentic object. But based on what you see, the representation, what are your thoughts? How confident are you? Oh, there you go. I am Kairos. Yeah, it does look cropped, doesn't it? Just a tad bit. uh, the guy on the right favors John Wayne. Yeah, good one, Sissy May. Ooh, looks stripped down. Yes. Oh, there's a good question there from Vaughn. Did our civilization even take this photo? Who knows? Or is this an actual genuine photo? Again, who knows? We're just asking questions. And you're giving your impressions about what you see. Robert says, looks like a cut and paste. Yeah, maybe. Who knows for sure? And remember, we're just looking at one photo. And you might recall in early channel explorations, one of the things that we emphasized is how many of these photos do we have where they just hand jam the date on them? For all we know, that could have been Peter Weller that actually wrote that date on there. I'm not saying it is. It's just kind of funny to think about it, especially with his Sharpie problems. But you look at some of the detail, and you can explain it away. You can say, well, it wasn't a very good photo. It wasn't taken with a very good camera. Not really sure about the tower, but it's still one of the most significant, if not the most significant landmarks in Kansas City, depending on your perception. But then you look at this other photo from a date presumably earlier when they were dedicating it, and you have the massive crowds of people turning out and the great celebratory fervor of the Allies after winning World War I, and to recognize all the unfortunate dead in the trenches of World War I. Although, oddly enough, when you look a little more closely at this photo, what exactly is going on back here? Is this really the mound, the hill that they built this on? It looks like we've got the surrounding terrain of Kansas City, but is it? And is the photo even taken in Kansas City? According to the archive, it is. But those are the kind of questions that we ask. What do you think's really going on right here? Is this the actual layout of one of those buildings that we saw? Did they change something? Now, I'm not playing any deception games here. This is stated to have been a photo in Kansas City of that hill before they completed the tower. What are your thoughts on this? Yeah, maybe. Bunch of people coming in there real fast and not really having a lot of time to deal with it. And oddly enough, you see a lot of mass gatherings like that in cities across the U.S. Oh, yes, it was all part of the celebratory nature of ending the Great War. Of course, we won't talk about that other terrifying event that followed the Great War, but nobody was really supposed to. And you might find it odd to know that official historical circles didn't really talk about that terrible event. That whole thing that was inappropriately titled the Spanish influenza. Hey, New West Reset, good to see you. ARB. Look at all those grown-up orphans. Yeah, and it might be a case of that for all we know. Oh, look at Jamie there. Looks composited. You don't say. Good observation as always, Jamie. Yeah, there are some elements of this that look a little bizarre. But I didn't take the photo. I didn't develop it. I don't know for sure. But just remember that even if I did, unless I was actually there, I was a firsthand witness. And what? I want to ask you that question. How challenging is it to find somebody who was alive now in the early 1920s who would have a conscious memory of this event? How old would they be now, and how well could they even recall it? And remember, we're only talking a simple 100 years ago. The real point I'm getting at is not whether the Liberty Tower was constructed by our civilization or another, just simply the uncertainty that we already have about one single monument in one city that was only 100 years ago. Something that should be very easy to document. And a lot of people say, oh, it's very well documented. Yeah, it's written down. There's lots of stuff that's written down. There's all kinds of stuff written about the Roman Empire that's been repeated and rediscovered. You, oddly enough, have strange anomalies going on here when you look closely at the people. But that's just one object. Now, going down from the monument to Union Station, this is apparently a colorized photo of the early construction on it. But again, if they've colorized a black and white photo, then what's that allude to? That alludes to altering the original photo, doesn't it? Photo taken from a flying machine. That's a good one, Sadie Lamp Duo. Yeah. Who knows? Maybe. Maybe it was more of those veterans of the Union Balloon Corps from the Civil War. Ah, look at that, KC-933. Yeah, it does look old and dirty. And we know that building certainly doesn't look old and dirty to this day now, does it? You're right, Marine. There is never a foundation image. I would love to see a foundation image of this building. Anyways, here's more of the original photo of it to give you an idea of its size and immensity. And this is a very large building, especially the roof to this day. Of course, it's now been turned into a shrine for the Kansas City Chiefs. I don't know if it's still the shrine for the Kansas City Chiefs. I'm sure it is. But of course, they have these very intriguing looking cranes, and you'll never see the actual blocks of the columns or the pillars lifted into place or anything like that. I don't know. Maybe we've got something like that going on here. It's just always a bunch of rubble. It's really strange. But that tends to be what we see. And here you have an image. I think this is from the 1930s, judging by the automobiles, as Mr. Worf would say. But it appears as though it's been there for a while, and they just needed to clean it up. And even looking at the skyline that you can see at Kansas City, most of the buildings are already there. Well, of course they were. It was after the Art Deco era. Didn't build much of the city after that. I mean, they did. Some of the buildings, Power and Light District and so forth. But, I'm not trying to hand wave anything. Now, the building appeared in this film. You may have seen this film, or you may not have. It was a TV movie, 1983's The Day After, starring Jason Robards. Jason Robards is a very interesting individual. He was an actor. His father was an actor too, and they went by Jason Robards Sr. and Jason Robards Jr. Then his father passed away, and he just went by Jason Robards. His grandfather was actually the manager of Teddy Roosevelt's 1912 presidential campaign in Michigan. Yeah, so obviously the Robards family was well connected. And I don't remember the name of the performer who portrayed his daughter, but she wasn't in the movie too much. He talked to her, and then we saw her trying to survive Kansas City. You might remember The Day After was one of the 3 major nuclear nightmare fear films that came out in the early 1980s. This one was directed by Nicholas Meyer, the very wondrous auteur, director-writer who composed Star Trek II and Star Trek VI. To this day, still considered by many Star Trek fans the best of the Star Trek movies. He's the one who, on a shoestring budget, managed to make this TV film that just utterly frightened people. And I remember these days. I remember people being frightened by this film. But Jason Robards is really the only big-name star in it. Of course, Steve Guttenberg turns up, and then Jeff Eastman, the guy who played High School Superman, even though his voice was dubbed by Christopher Reeve. Don't bring it up in conventions. I don't blame him for being upset about it. But anyway, what's interesting about this is they're actually standing on the Liberty Memorial right in front of the tower. You can't see the tower. It's behind the camera. But it's funny to me that the concrete actually looks exactly the same. Now, keep in mind, this was filmed in 82, so we're talking something 42 years ago. And Union Station here in the background looks exactly the same. And, of course, the skyline of Kansas City looks pretty much the same. So, I'm not suggesting anything about progress or anything like that. It's just something else that's interesting. Now, later in the film, after the 2 hydrogen bombs hit Kansas City, then we see Jason Robards return to try to find his family. Of course, they're all dead. And they superimposed an image of what we're informed was Hiroshima as part of the special effects. Although I'm not going to show the image again, but you actually see Jason Robards walking around what's left of Liberty Tower. They did a pretty good job factoring up the rubble, despite having a shoestring budget. Anyway, here's where things get really interesting concerning Mr. Jason Robards and why we're focused on him initially. So in 1991, and going on to this whole concept of not being confident in history, Jason Robards served in the United States Navy. In fact, he was in the United States Navy when the Pearl Harbor attack occurred. And he narrated this little exploration on it, or perhaps I should say documentary, as they called it then, on Pearl Harbor. And it was called The American Experience, PBS Pearl Harbor, Surprise and Remembrance. You can look it up yourself, and at timestamp 5734. And I'm not going to show it here. I'd rather give credit to the content creator who actually went to the trouble of posting this, because I had it on a VHS tape, but it was lost. And Jason Robards says the following. He says, I was there that Sunday aboard the USS Honolulu, Radio Man 3rd Class Jason Robards. So Jason Robards said that he was at Pearl Harbor and he was on the USS Honolulu. But yet there is a discrepancy with that, because official military record from 1941 says that Jason Robards is actually serving under a task force under the command of Admiral Halsey. Halsey was commanding from the USS Enterprise, and the USS Honolulu, which the ship that Jason Robards said he was on, was in Pearl Harbor. It was not part of that task force, because the Enterprise and the aircraft carriers were sent sailing west. This was the actual ship they said Jason Robards was on, USS Northampton. So, according to the official historical account, Jason Robards was not at Pearl Harbor. He was there in the aftermath when the Northampton and the Enterprise came back to Pearl Harbor, but they were not there when the surprise attack occurred. But yet, in the documentary, he clearly says he was aboard this ship, the USS Honolulu, Radio Man 3rd Class, Jason Robards. So what exactly happened? We're only talking about something that, from the time of this documentary, was 50 years earlier. Would Jason Robards not remember what ship he was actually on? Did he forget? Or did they just convince him when he did the documentary, hey, we want you to say that you were on the USS Honolulu even though you were not? Would he have accepted that? Problem is, we can't ask Jason Robards. He passed away in 2000. So keep in mind here, we're not even talking about an event 100 years ago, and we can't even confirm what ship a famous actor was on. Jason Robards, in his own voice on that documentary, said he was on the USS Honolulu. But official sources, to include military.com, which, by the way, is not an official source. It's an independent media site, but it reports on U.S. military matters. They say he was on the Northampton. He wasn't at Pearl Harbor. Kind of a big deal, wouldn't you say? So if we can't even get confidence and total confidence in recent history, which within 100 years, within 80 years, which is quote unquote very well documented and very well tracked by the United States military, who is all about keeping records of all personnel. Indeed, they still have records of all 72,000 of the missing from World War II who are still unaccounted for to this day. You can look up their name, you can look up their hometown, you can look up what year they were missing. But we don't know what ship Jason Robards was on December 7th, 1941. How ironic that today is December 7th, 2024, right? So, thoughts on that? Yeah, exactly, Petty. Exactly. Ah, Robert telling a story. Yeah, and it is quite a story, isn't it? And so we don't even have confidence in a memorial. We don't have confidence that a famous actor during the most famous battle of World War II, now granted there were many battles in World War II, but United States, let's remember Pearl Harbor, come on. And they did all those documentaries on it in 1991, 50 years after the fact. He wouldn't have forgotten. Nobody forgets what ship they were on. But I don't know. It'd be interesting to be able to ask him. Who knows? Now, from that, I want to transition for time and perception. You might recall the time exploration we did, and I just want you to think about how many different calendars that we have. How many different chronologies do we have? Different societies, different cultures all across the land. And it seems like there are several significant calendars. There's also debate in terms of what year it actually is currently. We'll get to that in a second. Yes, the good old Julian calendar used by the aforementioned United States military to make sure that you're programming your radio properly and you're putting in the right Julian date, because if you don't, you'll have problems. But the Julian calendar was used for a long time, wasn't it? Or was it? Okinawa was just as bad, according to history. Yeah, no doubt about it. Jacob, standard procedure, lie about everything. Well, you bring that up. Let's just really talk about that real quick with military officers. Military officers are sworn to support and defend the Constitution and obey the orders of all officers appointed over them. Who's the commander-in-chief of the United States military? That would be the president. So military officers will not lie, and if they do lie and they get caught doing it, they'll be charged on the Uniform Code of Military Justice. However, if they are ordered to lie, then they're going to lie. Otherwise, if they don't lie as they're ordered to, they'll be charged on the Uniform Code of Military Justice for disobeying a lawful order from a superior officer. That's exactly how it works. And so if you really think about that, what does that really tell you that you can actually verify even from a very effective record-keeping organization or institution such as the United States military, who we acknowledge is the only military that does divide up all the known lands into areas of operation, or combatant commands as they call them. Yeah, nobody else does that. I am Kairos. Write new narrative for new population with a new calendar equals reset. Well, exactly. And if anybody's ever read the Timothy Zahn Heir to the Empire Star Wars books, and Luke Skywalker himself even talks about that, how whenever there's a new government in power, they even come up with a new calendar. There was the pre-imperial date, and now there's going to be the new republic date. And what was the name of the government in the Star Wars sequels? I don't know. They never talked about it. You had to read the books. Okay. Anyways, so all these different calendars that allude to a reset. And finally, we get to what we're really talking about, the 5 eras theory. So I came up with the 5 eras theory as a way, but not the only way, to try to see how the past may have happened. And what we're going to do is we're going to go through each of the eras now for the rest of this exploration. We're going to talk about what we know, what we think we know, and then how long each of these eras may have been. And you can see how the 5 eras theory works. We're in our contemporary era. And yes, I leave the year 2023 up here because, that's when the channel started and that's when I started doing explorations. Although, interestingly enough, I'm getting more people in comments here saying they've been following me for years. So I don't know, are these people who knew me personally and now they're on the channel? I don't know, it doesn't matter. I'm thankful for everybody who wants to show up and support us. It's all good. But anyways, 2023, whatever the present actually is, the contemporary era, all of our events that have happened, the history that we've just been talking about. We do a lot of our explorations in the contemporary era. If not, well, technically we do all of them, but most of our focus is here because we're looking at any remnants that we have. Now, what's the break between the contemporary era and the 4th era, or the Tartarian era, as we call it? And remember, that's just a term of respect. We don't know what the previous civilization was called. Can also call it the Monument Civilization or the Dome Civilization, whatever. When was that break? Was it in the year 1850? Was it 1800? Was it in 1750? Did those years even happen? Because remember, I can't go and talk to Jason Robard's grandfather, or even Jason Robard's father, he passed away in the 1960s, to confirm that there was firsthand accounts of even 1899. Now, yes, there's video footage of people talking about the 1800s, and oddly enough, you might remember Jason Robard's voiced General Grant on Ken Burns' The Civil War. He also played several other presidents, very interestingly enough. Oh, and in the 1990s, he was in one of those 80-minute long HBO movies called The Enemy Within, about a coup within the United States military. Yeah, crazy things they had in those movies back then, 86 minutes long. But we're going to go and we're going to look at the rest of these eras, and we're also going to talk about what we call the foundation eras. And why do you think the foundation eras are more difficult to talk about than even the Tartarian era or the 4th era? What's the challenges that we run across? Jesse, since 2020 time has been an illusion. Yeah, well, who knows if it wasn't an illusion for much longer than that, wouldn't you say? But yeah, it's a good point. Uh-oh. Dwayne knew me in the womb. Oof. Death is an illusion, says RB. Yeah, it does seem to be, doesn't it? Don't ever come across anybody who remembers dying or doesn't remember being alive. You let me know if you do at some point. Ooh, Y2K. There's a term I haven't heard in a while. Yeah, that really had people's feathers in a ruffle back in 1999. I recall that. That was back when Jesse Ventura won the governorship of Minnesota. And then we haven't seen wrestlers in political office since. I can't imagine why. Or have we? Okay, I'll stop being ornery. But anyways, we don't really know how long each of these eras are. Because if you look at this, we're talking about all the guesswork we have to verify if a tower in Kansas City was built in the 1920s. We don't even know for sure if a famous actor was on a particular ship in World War II in 1941, a very well-documented event and the most famous battle for the United States. Anyways, so when was this reset event? Well, some people think they know, and they have very good theories behind it, and they say, it's around every 100 years, or other people say, for all we know, there could be a reset every other second. We really don't know. But what we're looking at here when we explore these 5 eras theory is this is one way to look at this and to gain an understanding. Now, the other question I've been asked is, how do you know there's 5 eras? I don't. It's a guess. It's a theory. There might be 10 eras, or maybe there really is just one era. And all the reset events are just something that kind of restart us at a certain point, but they're not really a hard break, and they don't really change the actual nature of the land, the nature of the society. We lose all of our history. Or, like the ending of the reimagined Battlestar Galactica. Although, let's be honest, that was just a certain creator's dive into nihilism. So, thoughts initially on the 5 eras theory. Do you think it's a good way to look at things, or do we need to step back and reevaluate or revise how we look at the past? Because what we're going to do is try to figure out how many years may have been in each of these eras. And yes, in this exploration, I'm going to give you my best guess. And that's exactly what it is. It is a guess. It is speculation. I'm saying it. And don't worry, I'm sure there'll be plenty of people in the comments when they watch this later that'll say, speculation, where are the facts? Give me answers. No, not yet, but I'll be getting to it since you've asked. Thanks for your patience. Does the first era begin at the last global catastrophic event? No, I think there's something before it, but we're going to get into each of them. So, reverse 1 and 2. Yeah, that could be possible. That could be possible. Sissy May, 250 years. Old World Hastings. I wonder if we should narrow our focus to just more recent history. Everything before 150 years ago or so is thick, milky. Well, true. But what isn't? Do we have to make some speculations? Is there a point to make assumptions? But should we remember that they're assumptions and keep open minds? That's one of the hardest things to do. Oh, New West Reset. Maybe Jason Robards is lying the same as when Brian Williams lied about taking fire on a chopper during the Iraq War. Yeah, it is really odd, isn't it? And what's even more odd to me, New West Reset, is the fact that that was on a documentary, and they even showed all these Pearl Harbor veterans. You would think that one of them would say, hey, Jason Robards wasn't on the Honolulu. I mean, this is only 50 years after the fact. Plenty of them are still alive. But, I mean, it's one of those really bizarre things. It's a good point, though. Anyway, so we are going to begin by looking at the 5th era. So one moment, please. And we're going to switch out, and we've got a really, really great picture to start the 5th era with. And I know it's just really going to knock your socks off. Ready? Here we go. Ah, yes. The wondrous architecture of the pencil skyscraper of the 5th era. Of course, those of you with sharp eyes will notice that there are some old world buildings in this particular image. Ah, yes. RB, I like timelines. I'm just bad at conceptualizing time. You know what, RB? Maybe we all are. I am, we all are. It's hard for us to conceptualize it, and maybe there's a reason for that. Robert, when were the Anunnaki? Well, since you're asking, I would suggest either the 1st or the 2nd era, maybe the first 2 eras, but maybe they didn't happen the exact way that we think of them. See, that's the beauty of this 5 eras theory, is it doesn't really discount anything. We don't discount the Anunnaki. We don't discount the MRC. We don't discount preterism. We don't discount many other things. So, Adam, I hate the pencil skyscraper. It looks like it's going to fall. Yeah, it doesn't exactly give you the confidence of something that's going to last for, 100 to 500 years, or, even the next 10 to 20. But who knows the reality behind it? So, But this is what we associate with the 5th era. This is what we see our modern cities. Tall glass and steel skyscrapers. And it still takes us about 4 to 5 years to bang them out. You don't really hear of any one-year wonders anymore. But they're taller, I guess. Now, does anybody know where this is? And I'll give you a hint. This is not, I say again, not in the Middle East anywhere. Is there anybody out there who knows where this is? And no, I'm not expecting the Kansas City residents to know this one. So... Well, you're not far off there, Lawrence of Olivia. You're not too far away from it. It's not Vegas. You're close, though. Geographically, or whatever that is, you're close. Godzilla stripper pole. Oh, that's a great one, RB. Oh, Julius. Yeah, it's not far from Hollywood. This is actually in the great city of Los Angeles. And you might remember there was a film that we reviewed back when I was doing Old World in Film. Yeah, it's in Los Angeles. And this was actually inspired from the movie set of the film Intolerance, a film from the 19 teens. And what they tell us is that they reconstructed this entire movie set. Although when you look at images of the movie set, you'll notice that the elephants look exactly the same. The symbols look exactly the same. So yeah, they still have this setting up here in this shopping center, this very bizarre Mesopotamian symbol in the middle of Los Angeles. And you might recall they also had that tire factory that's really close there. And that's been covered. So yeah, if you need any confirmation that you're in Los Angeles, look right in front of you. That'll give you the confirmation. I recall when I was there, they had a big, huge statue of a mummy because they were advertising that that Tom Cruise film that I didn't enjoy very much. You know, I'm not saying it's a bad film. I just didn't enjoy it very much, but very interesting. So is this some sort of remnant? Is it something else? I don't know. I didn't analyze it. I didn't really want to go close to it. There was some reason I wasn't drawn to that when I was in Los Angeles. And so specifically in the contemporary era, so we're exploring everything right now, our modern cities and all the remnants that we have of the fourth era. Now, if you go off of this 5 eras theory timeline, what happens is you go back further in time. You're going to have fewer remnants of the buildings and the structures that came before with the passage of time, and then whatever destruction or destructive forces occurred in each of these reset events. However, is it possible, though, that because the structures in the distant past were of a much greater scale, were larger beyond our ability to comprehend, that there could actually be more remnants than we realize from the foundation eras? That's something to keep in mind. But we'll stay in the fifth era for right now. And indeed, all these images that we have, a good question posed by Vaughn, were these pictures actually taken in the fifth era? I believe the majority of them were, but I could be wrong. Some of them could have been remaining photos from things going bad during the end of the fourth era, for all we know. But you tend to get this image. You have these more advanced buildings, even small towns and cities, that seem to show architectural prowess beyond our ability to do today, even with all of our great advanced heavy machinery. And let's not forget our logistical capacity that they did not have, according to official history in the 1800s. We have the modern highway system, we have the interstates, depending on what you call it, where you live. But then you see these horses and all this other how do we say, conflict in terms of technology, contradicting accounts, even in the image itself. But that's what we tend to get when we look at the fifth era. Oh, here you go, Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington. This is where they had the Grand Review of the Armies after the Civil War. You can actually see them walking and marching, I should say, and then doing their hard turn right here. And then, of course, the stands. Quite a photo it is. But, was this something, again, from the fifth era? I think most of these photos are, and this is when they were repopulating. But what are your thoughts? There you go, Lawrence. They had really good horses and wagons. They were all master chiselers and hammerers. You're right. All artisans. And we don't even need to talk about logistics because we can just say that, yes, they were able to do it. It was no problem. Yeah, exactly. Building ornate palaces. Just try, because everybody was an artisan. Seems to be what they tend to tell us. But we do a lot of our studies, a lot of our explorations on this time frame because there are hints and there are clues. Now, whatever the actual veracity of those photos, and that is something that we need to take into account because they may be accurate, they may not be accurate. Oh, this is a good one. This is actually from New York City, where you have somebody in the basement that's actually doing what we would call a health and welfare check today. Yeah, looks like some pretty healthy conditions. Definitely makes you wonder, though, doesn't it? And then, of course, no shortage of these incredible photos. This is the Empire State Building. At least that's what they tell us. This worker is just dangling off and doesn't seem to have a care in the world. I can't imagine why. Why is he wearing it? Looks to be a bellhop hat. I don't know. Maybe I'm just seeing that. Nice gloves, though. And he's got a nice big spanner right there as he's working on that. And you can see the Chrysler building there. Although, do you see any issues with this photo? I don't know. But we have these photos, no shortage of these kind of photos with these super workers that are going up there at death-defying heights. And you'll have people that'll tell you, well, they just worked harder then. Not only were they master artisans and craftsmen, they could suddenly build a whole new style, Art Deco, which they hadn't built before. So I guess they could master new arts and crafts instantly. And never mind the logistical signature of building buildings like this. I mean, yes, there's video of the Empire State Building going up, but is it continuous video of every single day and it's sped up or slowed down? No, but make of it what you will, as I'm fond of saying. But this is what you'll get. And then, of course, you have these kind of images where you see massive rubble and destruction, but then you got just a couple horse wagons. Very interesting, huh? Ah, airship photo with Guy Leerdon. Yeah, that's a good way to put it. I'm Kairos. That's a very good way to put it. Mm. Oh, thank you for that, Vaughn. I appreciate that. So thank you, Vaughn, and welcome to the new members. And that's for everybody who joined, and then the people who just joined off of Vaughn's generous gift. So thank you very much. I appreciate that. But you'll see that when you look at these eras and you look at what is really being shown to you. You know, ah, no, those are perfect wheels. I mean, could you imagine taking those wheels through lots of mud and rubble? No problem. Just get a strong enough horse, right? It's really that simple. But that's what we tend to see, those conflicts. And then cities that seem to be ridiculously populated. This is Vienna in Austria. We've looked at this before. Here's that lovely plague column they have. And of course, I'm being facetious. I would never say that any memorial dedicated to the death of many, many people is lovely, but artistically, it's very pretty to look at. The intention behind it's what I disagree with, but who knows? Who knows what it really represents and what it really signifies? And then here in Denmark, and you might recall we looked at this little object here when we were looking at symbols of Tartaria on this tower. Recently, something else that came up to a fire. So yeah, Denmark's got it too. And then New York City again with some of the incredible buildings on the skyline in the distant past. We've got domes, we've got very ornate towers. Yes, nobody's building like this today. Oh, look, looks like we've got another mausoleum of Helicanarsis over here because, you just can't get enough of those. But, recalling the Singer building and then what happened to the majority of these structures. Well, some of them survived, but a lot of the rest of them, unfortunately, like the Singer building, were torn down. The old World building, that was torn down too. Urban renewal, we got to make space. Now we've got cars. But the skyline was very impressive. And, early 1900s, I think this photo is attributed to 1910, but, I don't know for sure. I wasn't there. I didn't take it. It's very pretty, even with the dust and the monochromatic appearance to it. Yeah, there you go, Old World Hastings, all built in a very short amount of time. And that's exactly what you'll get with it, too. Yeah, I know, Sean. I mean, it would have been amazing to see it live action at that time. And then images such as Paris. And we've looked at Paris very recently, and, no shortage of old world buildings there, very incredible structures. But then you have these people just going around on their horse and buggy. So really it looked the same, or horse and cart, whatever you want to call it. And then, of course, you've got these destruction images, the original City Hall in San Francisco after that nasty earthquake. Although, oddly enough, there's accounts of the army actually creating fire breaks, and they created fire breaks by destroying buildings. So what was actually going on? Who knows? There was all kinds of destruction happening. There was an earthquake, there were fires, there were fire breaks, there was intentional, unintentional destruction of buildings. Is this a real image? Does this really reflect what this building actually looked like, or is it something else? I don't know. Like the palm trees, though. Of course, you got to have the palm trees. And oddly enough, just rubble all over the place. And so these are the images that we get of the Fifth Era. Clearly images that were taken from the Fifth Era. Oh, and now we go to Sweden. Yes, I intend to get up to Sweden here soon, the Nordic nations as they were, and especially explore some of the islands that they've inhabited. And you might recall we highlighted the fact that the Norwegians were the great polar explorers. They explored the North Pole and the South Pole. Now, yeah, they're geographically close to the North Pole, but certainly not the South Pole. But by golly, if you're going to do one, you better do both. Anyways, but they've got the same thing going on in their cities, massive towers, very impressive structure and architecture, and again, defying logistical limitations that we would expect for that time. Somehow they found a way around it if we go off the official history. And then Switzerland. I haven't explored Switzerland much yet either. That's on the near-term list. Don't worry, I've got some other promised explorations that are coming up soon. But when you look a little bit more closely, you'll see they've got the same thing there. Very developed structures. But, it's Europe. They had the time to do it. They were settled for hundreds or thousands of years, and that just makes sense. They didn't have the same limitations. Although the Industrial Revolution apparently happened at the same time. And then those upstart Americans got ahead because they developed the railroad faster. That's what the official history says, if you recall the exploration earlier this week. Another view of Paris, and very interesting down here. Hard to say what's going on in this photo, but again, you see all the extensive structures. Now, were these all built in the 1800s? Is the official history correct? I always keep that on the table. But do I find it likely that it is? No. And in fact, with every subsequent exploration, I find it less and less likely that that's what happened. Yeah. I could see that too. Well, exactly, Vaughn, the infrastructure under it. I mean, there's catacombs that are under Paris. We've talked about it, and we've explored them. So, oh, here's a good question. The Wind. Do you think the people that were alive then appreciated these buildings like we appreciate them now, even though we cannot see them? Here's a way to answer this question. How many of us, myself included, walked in, through, and around these buildings every day for our lives and did not appreciate them? I'm going to admit it. I did it for many years in my life. I walked in and out of that Iowa State Capitol and never thought there was anything special about it. It's just a state capitol. Yeah, it's pretty, but there's nothing extraordinary about it. There's nothing just otherworldly about it. So I think that for the most part, if there was anybody who still had some sort of memory or thought something, we know what happened to them, especially if they asked the wrong questions. Again, if you follow me. Yes, and then these watermarks that we have, all these aerials or these bird's eye view photos that we have. This is New York City, again from the 1800s, the early 1800s even. Although who knows how accurate it is? I mean, anybody can do a drawing at any time. But is it any more accurate than a photo? Oh, I don't know. It's all a lot of guesswork, especially when you consider how shall we say compressed Manhattan Island has always been. Yet oddly enough, when you look at it, it gives you the hint that there were some more advanced things going on even as early as 1812. Ah, yes, that nasty war. That war that the United States military didn't do so well in. Probably why they didn't ever want to try to invade Canada again. They finally had enough of that. But then you have these other odd images from New York, 1842, this water reservoir. Now, did this really exist or didn't it? I don't know. There are actual remnants, though, and there are hints that this reservoir did really exist. Quite an advanced structure for the early, or maybe I should say the mid 1800s, but even so, just incredible building, incredible architecture, and again, defying the logistical limitations. And who knows what's going on in the background here? Maybe you could say that's artistic impression or artistic expression, but who knows for sure? It's really, really odd. Mm. Oh, nothing to be sorry about, New West Reset. I mean, it's one of those funny stories, you know. You talk about how the United States military wanted to rely on its militia, and then its militia refused to cross the border into Canada. But that wasn't the last time. We also talked about those Fenian raids that occurred after the United States Civil War. Apparently, those didn't go well either. But make of it what you will. Ooh. Hollis, could it be that the precession didn't reel and the shift of the dome means a different dimension shift in recent years? That's entirely possible too. Can't rule that out. Oh, that's a good one there, Texas giant swimming pool. Yeah, that'd probably make more sense than anything else we've got. And then, of course, no shortage of all the great city fires that occurred mostly in the 1800s, although there are notable exceptions, such as the Great London Fire of 1666. But remember, Doctor Who was an alien that caused that, so maybe that's more credible. I don't know. But that's what we have. And then, of course, we have other impressive images that show us what New York City looked like in the 1800s. And that's what we're exploring: photos, paintings, bird's eye views. And then, oddly enough, some of these other impressive images. This is the Broadway Tabernacle in New York, circa 1847. Again, make of that what you will. Look at the size of these columns here, if this was real, if this did exist as they show us. And of course, it's got a nice big organ in it. I wonder how much it is similar to the tabernacle that still stands to this day in Salt Lake City. And you'll see that they've got the decorated columns here. I mean, what a building this must have been to go into. And I'm under the impression that, yes, it did exist. And I think the fact that there is still that tabernacle in Salt Lake City does give credence to the fact that this building did one point exist. So that's all we've got for the fifth era. And that's where most of our explorations take place. Sissy, I'd hate to know how many birds flew over that giant pool. Oh, that's a good one. Creators. Sound resonance. Yes. Probably very much in that structure too.